welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. On July 17th, the only Catholic church in Gaza, the Holy Family Catholic Church, was hit by Israeli fire, killing 3, wounding scores of others, including the parish priest. Israel says it was a mistake, a stray tank shelling, igniting a firestorm, particularly among American Catholics and Christians, many who had already been shifting support away from Israel on the issue of Gaza. Catholics, including Sohrab Ahmari, who joins us here today, jumped on comments by people like Luke Moon of the Catholic Philos Project, who lashed out against critics of Israel in the wake of the Holy Family Church attack. And comments called unacceptable and bridge too far. Moon said, church leaders are quick to blame Israel, and Israel has apologized. They never speak so clearly about Islamists. They're afraid to. It's not courageous to attack the Jews. It's easy. It's been easy for 2,000 years. One would think that the leaders of a billion-member church might not be so afraid, and yet they are. Meanwhile, evangelical Christian Joe Barry, managing editor of the conservative Onion, the Babylon Bee, is probably regretting comments he made about the outcry after the church shelling. He went on a rant saying, this won't be easy for people to hear, but there are only 200 professed Catholics still living in Gaza, and they all support Hamas. Obviously, this created a massive firestorm on X and other social media platforms in response to Babylon Bee's Joe Barry. John Daniel Davidson, the Federalist senior editor, said, I don't know about anybody else, but as a Catholic who supports and prays for my persecuted Christian brothers and sisters in Gaza and the Holy Land, I won't be sharing or boosting anything produced by the Babylon Bee or its anti-Catholic dispensationalist editors ever again. Barry doubled down, suggesting that this was all an effort to turn Christians against Israel, calling it, quote, evil forces trying to break up MAGA along racial and religious sectarian lines, and it's encouraging to know some people of wisdom and discernment see right through it, end quote. While polling still shows strong Republican support for Israel overall, there is still a discernible drop overall of Americans' tolerance for Israel's war in Gaza after more than 22 months of civilian death, destruction, and starvation. There is a notable drop among Americans under 30 on both sides of the aisle for support for Israel. MAGA, which includes a strong faith-based element, has been divided over the issue, as Barry said. But the blame, my guests here today are likely to say, are Israel's actions and the Trump administration's inability to stop them more than, quote, evil forces trying to systematically divide the coalition. The disillusionment, of course, goes far beyond the Catholics. Marjorie Taylor Greene, an evangelical Christian, has come out to call what is going on in Gaza a genocide and has specifically invoked her faith to explain why she is speaking out so vociferously against the Israeli government on this front. Quote, yesterday I spoke to a Christian pastor from Gaza. There are children starving, and Christians have been killed and injured, as well as many innocent people. If you are an American Christian, this should be absolutely unacceptable to you, end quote. Online outrage included as well Eric Prince, no pacifist or even critic of Israel, who actually accused Israel of taking, quote, pot shots at the cross at the top of the Holy Family Church. He too said he was finished supporting American funding for Israel's war in Gaza. He said Hamas need to die, but the real losers are the normal people in Gaza just trying to live. So what is going on here? I wanted to drill down on how Christians, and particularly Catholics on the conservative end of the spectrum, are part of a growing backlash against Israel and may play a bigger role in the potential policy changes where the war is concerned and what that might look like. So joining me today are the aforementioned Sohrab Ahmari, who is the U.S. Bureau Chief of Unheard Magazine and author of Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It. Dave DeCamp, the news editor of Anti-War Magazine and host of Anti-War News, and Andrew Day, writer and editor at the American Conservative Magazine. Thanks for joining me today on Trip the Beltway Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to see you all. I'm honored to have you all here with me today on the show. Thanks for allowing me that long lead up. I wanted to start with Sohrab about your I don't want to say the back and forth you had with the Philos people, Luke Moon in particular. Can you talk a little bit about the outrage that many Catholics felt when he went after the cardinal and in his exhortations about what happened and what is happening in Gaza? Where do you think that all came from with Luke Moon? And were you surprised yourself at the backlash that came afterward?
Kelly, thank you for having me, and it's good to be with you and Dave and Andrew. Let me just give you the backdrop here. So I'm an American Catholic, a convert of more than a decade now, but longer than that, I've held as part of my basic political DNA or political consciousness for as long as I've been basically like a mature, politically adult person, a basic support for the Jewish state. That is, I believed and still believe that, in a world that's divided into nation states, the Jewish people are eminently entitled to one to call their own. They kind of tried everything else in the 19th century. They tried converting to Christianity as figures like Heinrich Heine did, and still faced anti-Semitism. They tried, becoming good German and French nationalists at figures like Dreyfus and Herzl himself did. And then like the goalposts shifted. It was no longer good enough to be like civically or religiously European. You had to be racially European. So in that backdrop, even before the Holocaust, there was a clear need for if the world is going to be divided into these kind of bristling little nation states as opposed to the larger multinational empires that characterized the 19th century, then the Jews should have their own nation state. That was my conclusion very, very early on, and it hasn't changed. So that's the backdrop from which I'm coming into this. And I still think Israel is a reality. I support its existence. When October 7th happened, I said I'd support its, I'm not a politician, but I said I support its right to defend itself because it was obvious. Hamas came in and did horrible things. However, over the past year or so, as the war has dragged on, I, like many others, have begun to ask, what's happened? What is the goal here? Is the goal to reconquer Gaza for Israel? Is it to just obliterate the possibility of Gazan national life by destroying schools and hospitals and clinics and churches and mosques and every kind of dimension of organized life, to potentially with an eye toward what Israeli officials increasingly openly say is their goal of kind of migration? They call it voluntary migration, which is pretty rich if the backdrop to such migration is this kind of brutal coercion. If that's the goal, then look, I, as a friend of Israel, as someone who supports its existence and right to defend itself, I have to get off the ship. I have to say that it is on a morally and strategically catastrophic course, which at best could lead to the Jewish state becoming a permanent pariah state, given all the shifts taking place in global opinion. So this is the backdrop to the Holy Family Parish Church, the shelling of the Holy Family Parish. I'd already begun to voice my discomfort with, whatever the Israeli goals were and the means with which they were trying to achieve them. Then that happened, and I think I and many other Christians, not just Catholics, somehow felt more comfortable, to be honest. Now, some people would accuse us of hypocrisy, saying thousands of Muslim Gazans died and your reaction was muted. I kind of take that point, but people have their identifications, and for me, that attack, not just the attack, but the sort of wantonness of it and the casual response of Israeli officials and their defenders in the West really bothered me. And one of those people, and I'll wrap up here very quickly, one of those institutions was a group called the Philos Project, which is I joined its advisory board basically when it was founded. And the idea was to promote, quote, serious Christian engagement with the Middle East. I knew there was a pro-Israel component as part of that. I had no problem with that because, like I said, I'm not anti-Israel. However, I always thought that the safety and well-being of indigenous kind of Christian communities was also part of the picture. So what Luke Moon, the executive director of the Philos Project, did was initially he just said, well, what a tragedy, a single word, like a tragedy, and then added something like pray that Hamas surrenders or something like that. Like no acknowledgement that this was an Israeli mortar that had hit the church and killed 3 people, wounded 10, including the parish priest. And then a little later, he put out that statement that you quoted, Kelly, which basically like more or less accused Cardinal Pizzaballa, the Latin patriarch in Jerusalem, of blood libel or of anti-Semitism, which I thought, and there was no expression of concern, no expression of sympathy, no expression of there should be reparations, no expression of let's give them aid, the parish aid, nothing like that. It just went from, Hamas kind of is to blame, and then the church itself is to blame. So I quit the board of Philos on that day in response to that publicly. And I should say someone else as well, Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, a lifetime career U.S. diplomat who is very close to the Arab world and is very, very pro-Israel, I should say, quit the board of the advisory board of Philos as well, because I won't speak for him, but it's obvious why he would do it in response. And a number of other Catholics I know who were once associated with Philos are now disavowing it. And all that's left is like this kind of very messianic dispensationalist core that like just cannot treat Israel or the rest of the region rationally. And I know that was a very long answer, and I apologize.
No, I appreciate it.
But I just wanted to give the broader context of where I'm coming from. This is not like I'm not a lifelong BDSer or something like that.
Well, Dave, I know you're on social media a lot, and so you probably the whole Joe Barry dust up when Babylon Bee's managing editor came out and suggested that the Christians in Gaza weren't real Christians. And I think that, people recognized that those Western voices like Joe Barry, other evangelical Christians, are so fully in the Israel camp that they would be willing to throw their own Christian brethren under the bus. And I think people had a real, I know people had a visceral reaction to that. Like, are you saying that I'm not really a Christian because I don't support Israel? Like, what does that even mean? So it was almost taking the America First argument about whether or not our policies there are America First and overlaying it on this other aspect, which is, are you a real Christian or not, based on whether you support Israel's actions in Gaza? Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of surfaced a huge divide, even Catholics and Christians in this space?
Yeah, I really think things are changing when it comes to American Christians and their view of Israel. For me personally, I'm a cradle Catholic, but I was away from the faith for a long time. And I had a big reversion in 2023, and I only officially rejoined the church last year. So I kind of have the zeal of a convert right now. And with all this stuff that's been happening in Israel, I've been kind of really reading into Christian Zionism and what it's about. And it's a uniquely American evangelical thing, but it's also kind of baked in even for some Catholics. I mean, for me, myself, I remember when I was a kid, I'd read about Israel in the Bible. I'd see Israel on a map, and nobody really taught me about its founding. And I kind of just assumed, yeah, Christians support Israel. And that's what I gathered, from all these American politicians. I didn't really understand that you had people like Mike Huckabee, because I really remember him from when I was younger. Like it's a real theological thing for them, and they're really hardcore about it. And Joel Barry and the people at the Babylon Bee are. And I started noticing as I became a Catholic again, kind of their anti-Catholic, bent. And, some of it is in good fun, but some of it is deeply offensive to Catholics. And so to actually see him say that about Catholics
Yeah.
being bombed, I mean, it kind of blew me away. And because you know what he's saying there, he's saying that they all support Hamas. He's justifying that
Oh,
strike
yeah.
on that church. Initially, he said, "Oh, it's just a stray shell," which is hard to believe because these Israeli Merkava tanks, I mean, these are precision-guided weapons that they have. So he initially downplayed it, and then he came out with with that tweet saying that they support Hamas and that they're not true Christians. And to me, that was almost unbelievable. Like, I was kind of blown away by it. And it's kind of strange in 2025 because the Holy Family Catholic Church, I follow them on Facebook, and they post pictures and videos from their daily masses and their rosary prayers every single day. So I see these people living out, their Catholic faith in this kind of incredible way. And then so to see him say that, I mean, again, just like really outrageous. And, one of the people who was injured, I mean, one of the women who was killed, I recognized her from seeing her pictures. And it is strange. This has happened too with journalists in Gaza. You follow them every day on X or whatever, and then they get killed. And it's like, it's a connection that we have now to these conflicts that we didn't really have before. And so I think this is kind of part of the awakening. As I said, even with Catholics or Protestants who aren't dispensationalists, who don't have this theological reason to support the modern state of Israel, the pro-Israel stance was kind of baked in. But that's really changing. And I think Joel Berry's tweet is something that has really exposed it. And also that interview Ted Cruz did with Tucker Carlson, where he said, I learned in Sunday school, the Bible says God blesses those who bless Israel. And Tucker's question kind of really laid it all bare. He said something like, you mean the state that Benjamin Netanyahu leads, that's who we're supposed to bless? So I think things are really changing in that regard. And it's also, as I've become Catholic again, I've gotten kind of really into studying just war theory and the church's view and the Pope's views over the years on war, especially modern war. And the popes have essentially been unanimous that, like, in modern warfare, I mean, there's almost no justifying certain acts of war, especially what Israel has been doing in Gaza. So it really is. And you see Pope Leo has been very outspoken about it. Of course, Pope Francis. And I think this is starting to have an influence on American Catholics and American Christians in general.
That's a really good point. And I don't want to take this too far afield, but I remember when I was, writing about the Iraq War many years ago, and I think I wrote a few pieces about this for antiwar.com, the Christian evangelicals, particularly coming out of the Air Force, were right at the tip of the spear of our fervor of pursuing regime change and pursuing a remaking of the Middle East. They had people over there trying to convert Iraqis to Christianity. I can only describe it as a crusader culture, a very messianic urge that was going on. It wasn't coming from Catholics. It was coming from the evangelicals, particularly in the military. And so, like, this is not new in terms of, like, the differences that you are feeling philosophically between the Christian evangelical response to what's going on at Gaza and the Catholic response. Andrew, I mean, as an editor of American Conservative, you're obviously following a lot of conservative media and trends. It did seem like Mike Johnson got a big backlash for his trip to Jerusalem this week and the speech that he made at the Western Wall. How does this all play in? Was this bad timing for him? Because I just don't see how those optics were very beneficial, particularly a couple weeks after he shut down the House over not wanting to engage the Jeffrey Epstein files issue, and then in the middle of a very strong backlash by the international community over the starvation of people in Gaza. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And first, let me say thank you for having me on. Unlike my esteemed interlocutors, I'm not Catholic, but I'm happy you're letting me talk about this subject anyway. And I do have an evangelical background, so I grew up Southern Baptist. I was born in Alabama. My dad was in the military, so some of the worldview that you were just describing, I'm quite familiar with. As far as Mike Johnson, it certainly seems like bad timing, to close down house activities so that you can go to Israel. I think he even promised that he would be returning to his district, and instead he went to Israel. As far as the backlash he's receiving, I don't expect that to be widespread, certainly not in the evangelical community. But I do think we're seeing a discernible uptick in kind of awareness that there's a problem here, as far as Israel's relationship to the U.S. and to our foreign policy. Unlike Sohrab, whose writings I respect a lot, I've been a critic of Israel for quite a long time. And one reason for that is I noticed that a succession of presidents, I think every president of my lifetime, except one, has expressed frustration about Netanyahu and found him to be presumptuous and disruptive and kind of an obstacle to their foreign policy aims. The one exception is the first George H.W. Bush, who was president prior to Netanyahu really being as powerful as he would become. And Bush 41 certainly expressed frustrations about the Israel lobby, specifically because he was pushing for Israel to stop expanding settlements in the West Bank. So this has been a problem for a long time. One of the specific problems that the U.S. has had with Israel with regard to our approach to foreign affairs is the Israel-Palestine issue and us wanting them to solve this, ideally with a two-state solution, and Israel resisting our pressure to do so. And I do think now with these Christian attacks on with these Israeli attacks on, for example, Taipei, this Christian community in the West Bank where some settlers attacked, and then also what you mentioned, this attack by Israel on the only Catholic church in Gaza. Seems like that also brought to light another attack, I think a couple of years ago on a Greek Orthodox church, if I'm not mistaken, in Gaza. Yep. I think this has served as a kind of empathetic hook for many Christians to kind of become aware of the problems that exist in Israel with regard to Palestine. For some people, it became impossible not to say something because of their Christian faith. For example, we ran at the American Conservative a piece by Mike Casey, who was a foreign service officer for like 15 years. He was in Jerusalem at the Office of Palestinian Affairs. And when he was there, he became very aware of this Palestinian Christian community. He was developing relationships with them, and he noticed that a lot of Christians from the West who were visiting Israel didn't even want to interact with these Palestinians. It was kind of awkward for them to realize that the Christians in this Holy Land are Palestinians. He ended up resigning during the Biden administration because of the Gaza war. For others, I think, including Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire, I think these attacks on Christian communities, on the Catholic Church, have made it possible to say something, or possible to say something without receiving too much blowback. Michael Knowles, who works at the Daily Wire, where Ben Shapiro also works. Ben Shapiro is the most prominent person there. I don't know if he's technically Michael Knowles' boss, but he's definitely the most high-profile person. He's an uber-Zionist, obviously. And Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh, the Catholics that they have there, have tended to be kind of hesitant about criticizing Israel too directly. But after the attack on the church in Gaza, Michael Knowles came out and said, you're losing me. Israel's losing me. I've had enough. Similarly, Matt Gaetz, he was talking a lot about these issues and other issues, including a denial of visas for Christian missions to Israel. And I think for a lot of these people, this has been kind of an Overton window shifting event or set of events. And I think it also has alerted them to the more general problem. As Sohrab said, we all bring our own identifications, which influence how we interpret the world and what we pay attention to. But once you pay attention to an attack on a church in Gaza, which Israel denies they did deliberately, you start to wonder, well, what about these other holy sites or these other like mosques or civilian infrastructure that Israel has attacked and claimed that Hamas was hiding there or was a total accident? They start to be more suspicious of that. If they're learning about this Christian community in Taipei and the West Bank, they are also probably reading reports that are informing them about the general experience of Palestinians in the West Bank and the hardships and indignities they experience at the hands of Israel, the settlers, and also the IDF, who basically come in and act as like police force protecting the settlers. It's not a balanced relationship at all. And as far as Mike Johnson going to the Wailing Wall after closing the house to avoid uncomfortable conversations about Jeffrey Epstein, I don't think this is something that people were even aware of or critical of at least at this scale, prior to the Gaza war, kind of accelerating a decline in Israel's favorability among Americans, and especially recently with acute famine conditions that are producing all of these horrible images. Every president goes and does that. He might be the first Speaker of the House. I don't know. I think he is the first high official or the highest ranking one to go to a settlement in the West Bank, which he refers to as Judea and Samaria, using the biblical name that most Israelis also use. The fact that he is getting pushback for that suggests to me that there has been a huge shift in the Overton window, and I think we're going to see a kind of counter effort. People can read this article I wrote recently on Charlie Kirk. He's kind of teamed up with this group called Israel 365, which gets money from the Israeli Foreign Ministry to try to basically propagandize MAGA conservatives, including Christians. He had a focus group recently. One of the topics that he pursued there was, how can Catholics, because evangelicals are more supportive of Israel than Catholics in general, so how can we appeal to Catholics to get them to like Israel as well? So we're going to see a counter movement, probably also including just crackdowns on free speech. But that to me suggests that this, in Gramscian terms, kind of cultural hegemony here is breaking down, and that's why we're seeing this forceful response.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Sohrab. At the beginning of the war, you had conservatives ranging from Tucker Carlson to Sagar and Jetty to David Sachs, who were trying to make the case that U.S. taxpayers should not be paying for the war in Gaza, that it would not benefit us. It wasn't in U.S. interest to see this war conducted in this way or prolonged, and it wasn't even a good idea for Israel to do this. And it was a very careful argument made based on U.S. interests only. And I feel like that's where the right was more comfortable talking about this. If they were to be critical at all, it was in a purely U.S. interest-based way. Now I'm hearing people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Eric Prince talk about it in moral terms and through a humanitarian lens. This is a major shift. And can you talk about how important that is, particularly Marjorie Taylor Greene, popular Republican MAGA congresswoman who just didn't do a one-off. She's on there almost every day posting on X, calling this a genocide and daring anybody to say otherwise. And it's in pure humanitarian terms, not just a cold, hard, realist, special or U.S. interest framing. Oh, you're on mute.
I mean, this in a way reveals the limits of liberalism. Sorry, let me start over. Is this live?
Yes.
Okay.
No, it's not live. It's not live.
It's not live. Okay. So let's do
Sorry.
it. In some ways, this to me reveals the limits of really cold realism, which I found, for example, even John Mearsheimer, who's like a scholarly proponent of realism, often slips into moral arguments. It's not so easy to partition the strategic from the moral. And so, no, it is very significant. I do know that, look, we've always said, and I think you agree, Kelly, and maybe Andrew and Dave know as well, but there are people in the current administration on the younger side who work in the foreign policy and defense side of things, who don't so much have who don't have the moral dimension in mind. Often they're called like prioritizers, people who think, look, the world is horrible, but U.S.'s future challenges lie in East Asia and China. Which the more we get bogged down in the Middle East, the more we're going to waste time and energy that should have been spent, trying to deter China. That's there as well. But, people are people. And so although that's been the right's discourse when it's been expressed skepticism of Israel's policy and the degree to which we're tied to those policies, that's been the default mode. But now you're right. You're seeing people make moral arguments. I'm certainly making moral arguments. I can't, I just had this thread that was retweeted by lots of right-wing people, and then lots of progressives and liberals and others as well, where it has to do with the starvation. Like I cannot take those pictures of emaciated kids anymore. And what bothers me more is the gaslighting or the kind of insulting of my intelligence that says, initially said it's not happening, then said, yes, well, it is happening. It's kind of Hamas's fault. And then when Bibi did finally, under pressure, open up some of the aid crossings, his own hard right, well, whatever harder right than Bibi is, I guess the Ben-Gvir had a statement in which he said that it's a disgrace that Bibi had opened up the aid crossings. What they really need is shells, and more shells. But what that suggests is that it was Israel holding up the aid earlier on, right? So if Ben-Gvir blames Bibi for having opened up the aid, it suggests that Bibi has power of life and death over 2 million Gazans. And then now it's back to saying it's all staged. It makes me very angry when I see people respond to, there was a cover of Time of hungry Gazans, and some other photographer had photographed that photographer taking that picture, and they're like, oh, well, it's staged. No, it's just like, you're a news photographer, you're in this situation, people are going to crowd to where the camera is because they're desperate. There's no Hamas conspiracy in that taking of that picture. Or it's like, oh, well, this kid had a disability. It's like, well, yes, it is well known that children with disabilities will suffer the effects of severe malnutrition more dramatically and more quickly than other members of their family. So it's just this kind of casuistry and these kind of cheap arguments, like really, it brings out another side of me. Let me be honest. Not all of my tweets are always temperate. And then, because Andrew mentioned the West Bank and Taiba and the Palestinian village, look, the other issue is, my initial support for Israel, and still today, is kind of conditional on at least the pretense that there would one day be a Palestinian state. Otherwise, you have an Israel that rules over 5, 6, 7 million people as like second class. That is apartheid. I'm sorry. That's apartheid. There are many other parts of the world in which those conditions persist, where there's like a second class, third class citizenry. In Bahrain, it's the Sunnis who rule over the Shiites in some degrees in that way. Other parts of the Middle East, it's reversed. The Shiites rule over the whatever. But I'm not funding those societies with my tax dollars. I'm not arming like they're lunatic settlers. So anyway, to your point, it's just the moral and the strategic and realistic are never as easily severable as most realists imagine they are.
Yeah. Dave, are we seeing some limits here of how far Trump can go before he just loses his base completely? And I know I'm probably overstating it, but between the Jeffrey Epstein episode, where we saw some real pushback from his base. Now on Israel, Gaza, we've seen a ton of outpouring of critique against Israel, people saying, this is not what I voted for. I voted for America first, not Israel first. I mean, between those two things, does Trump actually risk his base? And does he risk it when he announces things like, I'm going to take over Gaza, or the United States is going to take over the humanitarian aid in Gaza at U.S. taxpayer cost? Is there a ceiling here in terms of what he can do in our name, where he risks just losing the only people who really have been behind him in these last 9-10 months of his first term, who've had faith that he was going to do the right thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's definitely going to lose some of his base on this, as they keep kind of doubling down on this just completely unconditional support for no matter what Israel's doing here. And I mean, you look at what just happened over the past couple weeks. The starvation began. I mean, people are starving to death every day in Gaza. And I think Sohrab had a tweet about this, actually, like your instinct when you see a picture of a kid that looks like that is correct. Like whatever you naturally feel about that is the right way to feel about it. And it's really unbelievable to me that people are having this conversation, acting like it's not always the case when famine sets in, that the sick people, young people start dying first. And I used to kind of have some hope for Steve Witkoff, but he just went over to Israel and he visited one of the GHF sites, just a total PR stunt.
Yep.
And then he met with the hostage families, and I heard his voice in a leaked recording that was played on Israeli media, that he said these claims of starvation are nonsense and that it's just Hamas propaganda. I mean, so this is monstrous stuff that Trump and his point man are engaging in. I mean, Trump and JD Vance have expressed concern about it, but at the same time, Trump's not doing anything about it. I mean, expanding the GHF, essentially what that's going to help this goal of full military occupation of Gaza, because they want to put the sites in the north in areas where Israel doesn't have total control. And it's so clear that that's what this whole organization, the Gaza so-called humanitarian foundation, is about, helping Israel expand its occupation and exterminate Palestinians. I mentioned before we started recording, this is a staggering statistic. Based on rough numbers, 1 out of 200 people in Gaza have been killed or injured trying to get aid. I mean, this is, and they're critical of the UN. I mean, there's plenty of criticisms to be had about the UN and the UN's kind of global aid system that I think are legitimate. But the fact that Johnny Moore and the GHF are trying to make these criticisms is just absurd. So I just don't, I think there's only so much that ordinary Americans who voted for Trump can take when it comes to this. And, how far is Trump willing to go? It seems like what he said yesterday, they asked him, do you support this plan for Israel to occupy, full occupation of Gaza? And he said, well, it's pretty much up to Israel. And we also have seen this framing. I've seen this from Witkoff. He was actually asked, this was another conversation he had with the hostage families a few months ago. They said, why don't you make Netanyahu stop this? Because they all want a deal to free the hostages. And Witkoff's answer was, Israel's a sovereign country. We can't tell them what to do, which, I mean, it just misses the fact that the U.S. is paying for this. I mean,
I'd like America to be a little bit sovereign in that sense too. Sometimes,
right?
Yeah,
where we do our own.
That's right.
Well, I mean, Andrew, I'm going to leave the last word with you, but I mean, it really is really apparent to me that the only way that this is going to stop is if Trump puts his foot down and he tells Netanyahu, you ain't getting any more of our $4 billion a year until you stop the slaughter and the starvation in Gaza. So far, he hasn't been willing to do that. And this is what all this business of taking over the humanitarian aid is he wants to look like he's doing something to address the starvation without doing the hard work of really telling his buddy to F off. And he's not getting any more of our weapons until he stops what he's doing. At some point, he may have to consider the nuclear option with Netanyahu. And I see conservatives playing a role in that because the Democrats aren't going to convince him. They're completely, it's not that they don't care, it's that they're politically ineffectual right now. It's really going to come from the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Steve Bannons and the influencers on the right to convince Trump to do the right thing. Do you agree with that? Do you think that we, as conservatives, as libertarians, as people, Catholics and Christians of restraint, do you think that's the role that we have right now is to actually affect the change that needs to happen?
Well, first, let me say I don't have high hopes about Trump on Gaza. I kind of did at the beginning. I wouldn't say high hopes, but I thought maybe the strength of his personality and some previous frustrations that he's expressed about Netanyahu would lead him to come in and kind of put Netanyahu in his place. I at least hope that might be the case. And it kind of seemed vindicated, that hope, when Witkoff was dispatched to Israel and he demanded a meeting with Netanyahu and he told him to agree to a ceasefire. And then right before the inauguration, indeed, a ceasefire did happen, although now it kind of seems like Israel was just trying to regroup with no expectation of following through and entering into the second phase. Trump has a very special connection with his followers, obviously. I do think that they are upset about the Epstein situation. I think they were a little alarmed initially that we were going to war with Iran all of a sudden. But, they end up kind of valuing Trump overall more than they do these issues. So I think those count as kind of chinks in his armor, and he needs to be wary of them. But his armor is basically still intact. And people should definitely keep up the pressure. I mean, we have seen that when the international community, especially the US, is willing on those rare occasions to pressure the Netanyahu government, it will, for example, let some aid in. Netanyahu basically admitted as much when he announced why he was letting aid in after the full blockade. He said, well, we're just going to let a little in, and we kind of have to because of all of this pressure we're getting. So, it's definitely achievable. We're giving them more than 3 to 4 billion a year now. I think since October the 7th, I think we gave them 17 billion in the next 12
probably
months.
More than that now.
And that doesn't even count a lot of like the missiles that we ourselves deploy, for example, when we're shooting down Iranians' missiles in a war that Israel instigated to disrupt our diplomacy. But the tail has never wagged the dog so successfully and so ferociously. I'm honestly feeling like there's something kind of strange and at present inexplicable about Israel's relationship to Trump. It seems like the whole MAGA movement is kind of becoming subservient to this, pro-Israel cause where, one of Trump's main promises was to crack down on immigration. So we're like deporting, lawful permanent residents who criticize Israel. Now we're going to deny emergency aid to states if they boycott Israel. The foreign policy restraint is kind of out the window. We attacked the Houthis for Israel. We attacked Iran for Israel. There's something here that makes me very pessimistic, because it seems like Trump is going to just kind of go along with whatever Netanyahu decides to do, even though we're going to foot the bill. And there's obviously a structural issue here too. Democrats kind of do the same thing. Biden did the same thing. So I guess I'll kind of end on a note of pessimism. I don't think that Trump is going to put the sufficient pressure on Netanyahu to stop this war. But I think we have to keep the pressure up, because there's at least a chance that the Trump administration will have to eventually say, okay, this is becoming too hot for us. We have to settle this thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a wedge. We need to keep pushing at it. And I think, it's very simple. This is not America first. This is not what I voted for. And I do think that resonates with a lot of folks on the right, and a lot of folks writ large. They are also very confused as to why we are pouring so much energy and focus and resources into the Israel issue and not addressing all of these problems at home, for which Trump, during the campaign said that our country was going to hell in a handbasket. So obviously he believes that there are problems that need to be fixed here that are not being addressed as far as we can see. So I really appreciate all three of you coming on to talk about this. I feel like we could probably talk for another 30 minutes, but I just hope that you'll come back when we have new developments to discuss.
Certainly. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Good talking to all of you.
Yeah, you too. Nice to meet you, Sohrab and Dave.